The rangemaster laughed when he saw the old man walk through the door, faded brown jacket, grey hair poking out under a cap so worn you could barely read the letters on the front. Rifle case in one hand, the other hand shaking just enough to notice. "He's just an old man," Derek said, loud enough for him to hear, loud enough for everyone at the counter to turn their heads and smirk. "Probably lost. Somebody point him toward the pistol bay before he hurts himself." The old man didn't answer, didn't flinch. He just signed the logbook with a steady, careful hand and asked for lane 7. And when he stepped up to the firing line 40 minutes later and squeezed the trigger, every conversation on that range died in a single heartbeat. If you believe some skills never fade, type honor in the comments. The man's name was Walter James Hendricks, 74 years old that September. He lived in a small brick house at the edge of a town that had mostly forgotten him, down a gravel road that ended at a stand of loblolly pines his wife had planted in 1978. Margaret had been gone 3 years now. The ache of her absence had settled into the bones of the house, the way cold settles into an old barn. He made coffee the same way she used to, black strong enough to strip varnish, and he drank it on the front porch every morning at 5:15, because that was the hour he had woken up for 53 years, and his body no longer asked permission to do otherwise. He walked with a slight limp on the right side, the legacy of a piece of shrapnel somebody had removed from his thigh in a field hospital in 1969. A faded tattoo peeked out from the edge of his rolled-up sleeve sometimes. An eagle, a globe, an anchor, the ink so worn that the globe looked more like a soft blue bruise. He had calluses on the pads of his index fingers that never quite went away, and a habit of placing his hand flat on any table before he sat down, the way a man does when he wants to feel the grain of the wood and be sure it is solid. He did not talk about what he had done in his life, not to the young cashier at the hardware store, not to the pastor who came to visit once a month, not even to his daughter Rebecca, who lived 3 states away and called on Sundays, because some things Walter decided long ago were better carried alone than set down on the shoulders of someone who loved you. His rifle case had a dent on the corner from a time he didn't like to remember, and the key to its lock hung on a leather cord around his neck under his shirt, warm against his breastbone like a second heart. Once a year, on the last Saturday of September, he drove 90 miles to Pine Ridge. He filled the thermos. He packed the sandwich Margaret used to pack for him, the way she had taught him to pack it. And he went to the range because there was one thing he still needed to do. One thing he had promised a man named Staff Sergeant Elias Moore, a long time ago, in a jungle that no longer existed on any map. What none of the men laughing behind that counter that morning could possibly know was that the old man with the shaking hand had once been, for a brief and terrible stretch of years, the most accurate rifle in the United States Marine Corps. Pine Ridge Long Range Facility sat on 200 acres of cleared pasture and red clay out past the last reliable cell signal in the county. The bays stretched from 100 meters all the way to a full mile. The main building was low and utilitarian, painted the color of an old military olive drab, with a steel flagpole out front and an American flag that snapped in the wind even on days when nothing else moved. A sign by the gate read, in black letters on white enamel, "Shooters only. No spectators, no exceptions." Under the sign, smaller and almost an afterthought, hung a second plaque, founded 1979, by Marines for marksmen. Inside the front office was a long counter, a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned since Reagan's second term, and a wall. The wall was the reason people drove 6 hours to get there. Every record ever set at Pine Ridge was engraved on a brass plate and mounted on that wall in rows so neat they looked like headstones. 70-yard pistol, 200-meter carbine, 400-meter semi-auto, 800-meter bolt-action. The plates had darkened with age, and some of the oldest ones near the bottom had green patina around the screws. At eye level in the dead centre of the wall, framed in a case of dark walnut that had been oiled so many times it glowed, sat the biggest plate of them all. It was labelled the Mike course. 10 rounds, 5 distances, 4 minutes, and beneath it engraved in letters half an inch high, record, 98 out of 100 in 417, W.J. Hendricks, USMC, August 14th, 1985. Nobody had beaten it. Not in 40 years. Not the 3-tour Army Ranger who tried in 92. Not the civilian national champion who had flown in from Texas in 2004 and broken down crying in the parking lot after his 4th attempt. not the Delta operator who showed up unannounced in 2017 and walked off the line without saying a word. The plate was so famous that there were framed photographs of it hanging in gun shops in 4 states. Derek Callahan had worked the counter at Pine Ridge for 18 months. He was 26. He had tried out for Force Recon once and washed out in the first week, a thing he did not talk about unless he was drunk, and a thing he was drunk about more often than he liked to admit. He told himself he worked at Pine Ridge because he wanted to be around real shooters. The truth was that he wanted to be around them so he could be the one deciding who counted and who didn't. And on that particular Saturday morning, with the coffee pot freshly burned and the early sun slanting through the bay windows, Derek Callahan had decided that the old man signing the logbook in front of him did not count at all. He didn't know the name on the logbook, hadn't even read it. And that was about to be the beginning of the worst day of his entire professional life. "Sir," Derek tapped a pen on the counter. "Sir," I said, "you need to show me a membership card or pay the day rate. Which is it going to be?" Walt pulled a worn leather wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket. He opened it slowly, not with the hesitation of a man who didn't understand, but with the deliberation of a man who had long ago stopped letting anything rush him. He laid a membership card on the counter. The card was dog-eared at the corners. The lamination had cracked along one edge. The photograph on it showed a younger man with dark hair and a squared jaw, though the face was unmistakably the same. Derek picked it up. He looked at the date on the back. He snorted. "Bro, this card expired in 2003. "It's a lifetime card," Walt said quietly. "They don't do lifetime cards anymore. They did then." Derek looked at the card again, turned it over, looked at the old man, looked at the card. The lifetime cards had been issued for exactly 1 year, 1979, the year Pine Ridge opened, and only to the founding members. There were supposed to be 23 of them. Derek had seen 2 of those cards in his life. Both had been brought in by men who arrived on the anniversary of the opening and left bottles of bourbon on the counter before walking out. He slid the card back across. "Fine. Lifetime member. Whatever. What do you want to shoot today, Grandpa?" "Lane 7, Walt said. "The Mike course." The grin that had been creeping up one side of Derek's mouth froze there, halfway formed. Jeff, the other counter attendant, looked up from his phone. 2 shooters waiting behind Walt went very still. The only sound in the office for a long second was the slow whirring of the ceiling fan. "The Mike course," Derek said. He said it the way you say the punchline of a joke you're trying to figure out. "You want to run the Mike course?" "Yes." "Sir, the Mike course costs $120 to run. It's cold bore. 1 attempt, no warm-up, no do-overs, 10 rounds total, scored and timed. It's the hardest course on this property. There's guys who shoot here every weekend for 6 years and never even asked to try it." "I know what it is." "Do you?" Walt reached into his other pocket. He counted out 6 20s onto the counter, smoothed them flat under his palm, and slid them across. He did not look away from Derek's eyes while he did it. His hand was trembling. His eyes were not. Derek stared at the money. Jeff was staring at Derek. A young man named Marcus, who had come in for his usual Saturday 100-meter practice and had not yet paid his own day rate, was standing very still with his rifle bag slung over one shoulder, and he had forgotten to breathe. "Fine," Derek said finally. There was something forced in his voice now, something brittle. "Lane 7, the Mike course. You got 10 minutes to get set up, but I gotta tell you, Grandpa, last guy to even come close to that record was a Delta Force dude in 2017. He dropped 11 points and his time was 30 seconds over, so don't feel bad when you don't finish." Walt picked up his rifle case. He nodded once. He said, "I won't." And he walked past the record wall without so much as glancing at it. Word travelled across Pine Ridge faster than the wind did. By the time Walt was unlatching his rifle case at the bench on Lane 7, there were 11 shooters pretending to do other things within sight of him. Jeff had abandoned the counter and found a reason to be wiping down the observation window. 2 guys who'd been sighting in at the 200-meter line had come back to the office for water. A husband and wife pair loading magazines in the parking lot had drifted to the edge of the covered walkway, close enough to hear but not close enough to be accused of staring. Nobody wanted to admit why they were there. Everyone knew why. Derek stood just inside the office door with his arms crossed. He was grinning the kind of grin people put on when they are afraid of something and don't want to look afraid. He had called 3 of his friends. "You gotta get down here, bro. There's an old guy. He's about to try the mic. I'm not kidding. No, I'm serious. Bring a phone." Walt ignored every one of them. The rifle case opened with 2 clean clicks. What lay inside was not a piece of equipment, it was a relationship. A Remington 700 pre-80s vintage, fitted with a fixed inertial scope that looked older than some of the men gathered to mock him. The stock was walnut, darkened at the cheek weld, and the grip to a colour that was almost black. The barrel had been shortened and recrowned in 1983 by a gunsmith in Quantico, whose name was not written down anywhere, but whose work could still be recognised by people who knew what they were looking at. A strip of olive drab tape ran along the underside of the forend, placed there to cover a chip that Walt had never been able to bring himself to repair because of how the chip had gotten there. He laid the rifle on the bench. He laid out 10 rounds of hand-loaded 168 grain match ammunition in a row beside it, each one standing upright, spaced exactly 1 inch apart. He laid out a small spotting scope. He laid out a green rag that had been folded the same way for 40 years. Then he sat down on the shooter's stool and did nothing at all for a full 2 minutes. Marcus, the young shooter from the office, had quietly found a reason to bring his own bag to the bench on lane 9. From there he could see everything. He watched the old man close his eyes. He watched the old man breathe. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 6 seconds out. A cadence Marcus vaguely recognised from a video about competitive shooters, but had never actually seen a human being perform. The hand that had trembled in the office was not trembling anymore. The shoulders were not tight. The old man looked, in that moment, like a man who was not about to shoot a rifle. He looked like a man settling into the driver's seat of a car he had driven for 50,000 miles. From the office somebody laughed. Derek's voice too loud. "Any minute now, boys, any minute." Walt did not move, and 300 miles away, in a house in Norfolk, Virginia, a retired gunnery sergeant named Thomas Branson picked up his phone to check the Pine Ridge shooter log, a habit he had kept every Saturday morning for 11 years, ever since his wife had died and left him with too much time on his hands. He scrolled down the list of the day's entries. He stopped. He read one name twice. Then he stood up so fast he knocked over his coffee, and he reached for his keys. Walt opened his eyes. The air on lane 7 smelled the way it had always smelled. Burnt powder from someone else's earlier session, damp grass from the overnight rain, the faint copper of brass cooling in the morning sun, pine far off, where the range ended and the tree line began. He had smelled this same mixture on this same lane 10,000 times in the summer of 1985, and 10,000 times again in every year he had come back since. Some smells don't change. Some smells are what a place is, underneath whatever else it thinks it is. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the way she had stood at the kitchen window on the morning of August 14th, 1985, and handed him a thermos of coffee and said, "Don't make it weird, Walt. You either shoot it or you don't." He had kissed her on the forehead. He had driven the 90 miles. He had shot the Mike course cold in the second attempt of his life, with a rifle he had built in his own garage, and he had walked off the line knowing he had done something he would not speak about again. He thought about Elias Moore. Staff Sergeant Elias Moore had been Walt's instructor at Quantico in the winter of 1967, a black man from Detroit with a quiet voice and the steadiest hands of any human being Walt had ever met. Moore had taught Walt how to breathe, how to let the rifle find the target on its own, how to trust that the round would go where the physics said it would go if you simply stopped fighting the physics. And when the two of them had gone to Vietnam in 1968, Moore had saved Walt's life twice, once with a radio call and once with a shot at 840 yards under a triple canopy that nobody who had not been there believed had been possible. Moore had died on November 9th, 1968, with Walt's name as the last word out of his mouth. Walt had set the Mike course record in 1985 because he had told Elias Moore in a field hospital that he was going to. He had not set it for glory. He had not set it to win anything. He had set it because a promise was a promise, and Elias Moore had been the kind of man who took promises seriously, even from a 20-year-old kid who had no business making them. And now, at 74, with Margaret gone and his knees failing, and the dent in his rifle case holding the memory of the one time he had dropped it, on the tarmac at Da Nang, the day they brought Moore's body home, Walt had come back one more time. Not to set a record. He had already set it. He had come back to beat it. Because a man named Elias Moore, 40 years earlier, in a hospital bed, had looked at Walt with sweat on his forehead and whispered, 98 ain't 100, son. Walt picked up the first round. He did not chamber it yet. He turned it in his fingers, feeling the weight, feeling the smoothness of the case, the slight oiliness of the bullet where his thumb had rubbed against it in the drive-up. He set it down. He picked up the next round. He did the same thing. He did this for all 10 rounds in sequence, and the entire process took him something close to 90 seconds. And from the office, Derek Callahan could be heard saying, "Oh my God, is he praying over the bullets? Is this actually happening?" Marcus, on lane 9, had stopped pretending to do anything else at all. He was openly watching now. His rifle lay untouched on the bench beside him. Walt settled into the prone position on the shooting mat he had carried in under his arm. The mat was older than the rifle. It had been stitched and restitched in 4 places. He adjusted the bipod. He set the rear bag. He slid the bolt forward and chambered the first round with a motion so economical it looked almost like a mistake. Like his hand had just briefly touched the rifle and a round had happened to load itself. The Mike course started at 400 meters, a steel silhouette, 1 round, then 475, 1 round, then 550, then 600. Then it climbed. 700, 800, 900, and finally, twice, at 1,000 meters. 10 rounds total, 10 hits required, points deducted for every deviation from center mass, scored by an electronic pad behind each steel plate that had been installed in 1999 and was now considered the most accurate scoring system on the East Coast. 4 minutes from the first trigger pull to the 10th. Walt checked the scope. He checked the wind, reading the flag on the 400-meter berm, then the flag on the 700, then the one on the 1,000, each flag giving him a different story about the air. He adjusted a windage knob by 1/8 of a click. He did not adjust elevation. He had zeroed this rifle at 600 yards 40 years ago, and he had never felt the need to zero it anywhere else again. "Shooter ready," said the range officer, a man named Pete who had worked at Pine Ridge for 12 years and who had stopped smiling 3 minutes earlier. "Ready," Walt said. "Stand by." The whole range held its breath, and at that exact moment, a black Ford F250 came tearing up the long gravel driveway at a speed that kicked rocks into the side of the fence, and a retired gunnery sergeant named Thomas Branson jumped out of the driver's seat without even closing the door, and Derek Callahan from the office doorway said, "Oh, what the hell now?" without yet understanding that the man running across the gravel lot toward the firing line was not running toward Walt to stop him. He was running toward Walt to be there when it happened. Tommy Branson was 63 years old. He had retired from the Marine Corps in 2004 after 29 years, the last 19 of which had been spent as an instructor at the Scout Sniper School at Quantico. He was 6'1", had a grey crew cut, and wore a plain green field jacket with no visible insignia, except for a small pin on the collar that nobody standing in the Pine Ridge lot that morning was qualified to identify. He walked with the particular rolling gait of a man whose knees had been destroyed a long time ago and whose pride would not let him complain about it. He did not say hello to anyone. He did not go to the office to sign in. He crossed the gravel, stepped up onto the covered firing line, and stopped exactly 10 feet behind lane 7. He did not move from that spot. He did not speak. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that anyone who had ever served under a Marine senior enlisted man would recognize at 100 paces. Pete the range officer looked at Tommy. Tommy nodded once. Pete nodded back. Derek pushed through the small crowd that had now accumulated behind the shooting line. Hey, buddy, you can't be up here unless you're—" He stopped. Tommy had not turned his head. Tommy had not even blinked. Tommy was staring at the back of Walt Hendrix's head the way a man stares at something he thought he would never see again in his life. "You can't be up here," Derek tried again, with about half the confidence. Tommy spoke without looking at him. His voice was quiet. It carried, "Son, I need you to go back to the office, sit down and be quiet right now." "Excuse me, I know who you work for. I'm friends with him. You're going to want to do what I just said." Derek opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Jeff, who was looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between panic and pity. He looked at Tommy. He looked at the old man on the mat. He looked back at Tommy, who had still not turned his head. Derek went back to the office. Marcus, on lane 9, quietly took out his phone. He did not raise it. He did not film. He simply held it in his hand because he had the feeling, the first time in his 23 years of life he had ever had it, that he was standing on the edge of something he was going to want to remember in detail, word for word for the rest of his days. Tommy Branson looked at Walt. Walt had not acknowledged him. Walt could not have, even if he had wanted to. Walt was somewhere else. Walt was 400 meters away in his mind, already in the scope, already in the breath. Tommy knew this because Tommy had been the one, 36 years ago, who had brought a young instructor named Walter Hendricks to Quantico to teach the first class of a new generation of scout snipers, and because Tommy had himself been a student in Walt's very first class in the spring of 1976. Tommy Branson had learned to breathe from the man who was about to squeeze that trigger. He adjusted his cuffs, he set his jaw, and he prepared himself to witness something he had believed, in his heart, he was never going to witness again. In the office, Derek was not taking it well. He paced behind the counter. He checked his phone. He looked out the window at the figure of Tommy Branson standing behind lane 7 like a monument, and he muttered to Jeff, "Who the hell is this guy? I run this range. I run this range. You can't just walk in and—" "Derek," Jeff said. "What?" "That's Gunny Branson." "Who?" "Gunny. Branson. He taught scout sniper school at Quantico for 19 years. He's on the wall in the back room, behind the filing cabinet. You ever clean back there?" Derek went very still. "The picture?" "The picture, Derek." The picture in the back room of Pine Ridge was a grainy colour photograph taken in 1987, showing 4 men standing in front of this very firing line, holding rifles, squinting into a sun that had long since set on all of them. 3 of the 4 were no longer living. The 4th, in the photograph, was a younger version of Tommy Branson, his arm around the shoulder of an older Marine with dark hair and a squared jaw, and at the bottom of the photograph, in faded silver Sharpie, someone had written the names Walt Hendricks, Tommy Branson, Ben Garcia, Jimmy Voss. August 14th, 1985. Mike Corse. Derek looked at the counter, at the logbook, at the name Walt had written that morning in careful, steady letters. W.J. Hendricks. Jeff was watching Derek's face. He saw the moment it happened. He saw the colour leave in stages. First the cheeks, then the nose, then the hollows under the eyes, then the lips, all of it going the colour of dry paper in about 2 full seconds. "Oh," Derek said. "Oh, God!" "Yeah," Jeff said. "Oh, God, no, Yep. What do I—" "You don't do anything," Jeff said. "You stand here. You do not go out there. You do not say one single word. You let this happen, and then when it's over, you're going to walk out there like a man, and you're going to apologize, and you're going to hope, really hope, that he is the kind of Marine who accepts apologies." Derek stared through the window. Out on the line, Walt exhaled. The slow, long exhale of a man who had been waiting, not for courage, not for permission, but for the exact second when the air between the muzzle and the target went perfectly still. "Stand by," Pete the range officer said again. Pete's voice cracked on the second word. A full 40 years after the afternoon WJ, Hendricks, USMC, had put a round through the 400-metre silhouette at Pine Ridge and begun the most storied 4 minutes in the history of that range. The same man, on the same mat, in the same wind, under the same flag, touched his finger to the trigger. Nobody on that firing line knew exactly what they were about to see, but every one of them, down to Derek Callahan with his face pressed to the office glass, understood that whatever it was going to be a thing they told stories about for the rest of their lives. The first round left the barrel at 9:47 a.m. The report wasn't loud, not really. Not by the standards of the belt-fed weapons on the next range over, but it was clean, it was sharp. It was the sound of a rifle that had been built for one purpose and fired by a man who understood that purpose the way a cellist understands a Bach suite. At 400 meters downrange, the steel silhouette rang like a struck bell. The electronic pad behind the target registered the hit. A small green light on the scoring console at the back of lane 7 lit up. Next to it, a number appeared in red LED segments. 10. Dead center, maximum points. A breath went through the crowd. Not a cheer, a breath. The kind of breath a congregation lets out when the soloist hits the first clean note. Walt didn't move. He worked the bolt, an almost invisible motion, up and back and forward and down, the brass pinging lightly on the concrete, and he was already on the next target. 475 meters. The report came. The steel rang. The console lit up. 10. Tommy Branson closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, they were wet, but he did not move to wipe them. Marcus from Lane 9 made a small sound in his throat that might have been a laugh, and might have been the beginning of a sob, and that he himself could not have identified if pressed. 550, the rifle spoke. The steel rang. 10. 600. 700. 10. 10. By the time the round left the barrel at 800 metres, the entire range had stopped moving. Pete the range officer had not called out any of his customary cues. He had simply stood with his stopwatch in one hand and his radio in the other, and he had not said a word for 2 minutes and 11 seconds. The men and women gathered behind the firing line had begun, without any of them deciding to do it, without any of them even noticing they were doing it, to remove their hats. Derek Callahan was no longer in the office. Nobody had seen him come out. He was standing at the very back of the crowd, where the covered walkway met the open air, with his arms hanging limp at his sides and a look on his face like a man watching the house he grew up in burn down. The 8th round struck steel. 10. The crowd exhaled again. Somebody, a woman, maybe the wife from the parking lot, began to cry quietly. The 1,000-metre target stood at the far end of the range. 2 silhouettes side by side, painted black against the red clay of the berm. Even on a clear day they looked small. On a windy day they looked impossible. This was a windy day. Walt dialed his knobs. 3 clicks. He paused, then added one more. He settled into the rifle. His hand, the one that had shaken in the office 4 hours earlier, was perfectly still. 30 seconds, Pete said, in a voice that had come back to him from somewhere. Walt did not hurry. He squeezed. The 9th round crossed 1,000 metres of air in roughly a second and a half. It travelled through a crosswind that shifted twice in that second and a half, dropped 31 feet from the point where it left the muzzle, and struck the steel silhouette 3/4 of an inch above dead centre. The pad registered the hit. The light lit up. 9. A tiny groan went through the crowd. The only imperfect shot. And it was still better than what most competitive shooters could manage on the best day of their lives. Walt did not react. He did not even appear to register it. He was already working the bolt again. The last round, the 10th round, sat in the magazine, waiting. At the back of the crowd, Tommy Branson leaned very slightly forward. His weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. He was holding his breath, and he did not know he was holding his breath, and he would not realize he had held his breath until the round landed and the air came out of him all at once in a long, ragged release. Walt adjusted one click of windage. He let the rifle settle. He waited. Not for the wind to stop, because the wind never stops, but for the wind to tell him when it was his. The flag on the 1,000-metre berm lifted. Fell, lifted. Held, held, held. He fired. The shot travelled exactly as he had asked it to. It struck the second silhouette 3/8 of an inch left of centre. The pad read it. The console flashed. 10. And then, under the scoreboard, in letters that appeared only when a course had been completed, a new line of text illuminated itself for the first time in 40 years. New record. Pete stared at his stopwatch. He had forgotten, somewhere around the 6th shot, to read it. He looked down now. 3 minutes, 51 seconds, 3 minutes, 51 seconds, and 99 points out of a possible 100. The old record, Walt's own record, the one that had stood longer than many of the people watching had been alive, was 98 in 4:17. He had just beaten it by 1 point and 26 seconds, at 74 years old, with a rifle older than the Rangemaster, on the first cold-bore attempt of the day. The silence on the firing line was the silence of a church after a verdict. It lasted something close to 5 seconds, which in real time is not long at all, and in that moment felt like a full minute. And then Tommy Branson, the retired gunnery sergeant, 6'1" and 63 years old and standing 10 feet behind the mat. Tommy Branson brought his heels together, squared his shoulders, raised his right hand to the brim of an invisible cover, and saluted. He held the salute. He did not lower it. And one by one, every veteran in that crowd, the man on lane 9 who had done 4 years in the army, the woman from the parking lot whose Navy father had taught her to shoot at 7 years old, the quiet older gentleman behind the counter who had flown choppers in Desert Storm and never talked about it, every one of them came to attention and raised their own hand. What none of them realized, not even Tommy Branson, was that the old man on the mat had not yet done the hardest thing he had come to Pine Ridge to do that morning. The shooting was the easy part. Walt cleared the rifle. He pulled the bolt back and laid it open. He checked the chamber with his eyes and then, because Elias Moore had taught him to check it twice, with his finger. He set the rifle down on the bench with the muzzle pointed downrange. He did not look at the scoreboard. He did not turn around. He did not yet know about the salute. He reached into the inside pocket of his brown jacket. He pulled out a single folded piece of paper, yellowed along the creases, worn soft with 40 years of being carried. He unfolded it. He smoothed it against the bench. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to someone who had been dead since November 1968. Walt read it to himself. His lips moved. Then he folded it back up, with the same 4 folds it had always had, and he placed it inside an empty brass casing from the first round of his course, the 400-metre round, the one that had started everything. He stood the casing up on the bench. He did all of this without any apparent awareness that there were 31 people standing behind him with tears running down their faces. Only then did he turn around. He saw Tommy. Tommy was still at attention. Tommy had not dropped the salute. For a very long second, Walt Hendricks did not move. His eyes, pale grey, the colour of weathered cedar, travelled across Tommy's face. They took in the crew cut, the field jacket, the pin on the collar. They stopped at the pin, which had been given to Tommy Branson in 2001 for a mission he would never talk about to a civilian, and which Walt himself had recommended him for. Walt's hand came up, slowly, the way an old machine comes up when you turn the crank. He returned the salute. It was not crisp. It was not regulation. His fingers shook a little on the way, but it was given, and it was received, and between the two of them, on that firing line, something settled that had been unsettled for 40 years. "Gunny," Walt said. "Colonel," Tommy said. Derek Callahan at the back of the crowd made a sound like a man who had just been punched in the stomach from the inside. "Colonel." Walt dropped the salute first. He walked forward, past the mat, past the rifle, past the bench. He crossed the 10 feet between himself and Tommy in 6 slow strides. He stopped in front of him. He looked up. Tommy was 4 inches taller, and he said quietly, so quietly that only the two of them heard it, and Marcus on lane 9 caught a syllable and later wrote it down because he knew he was hearing something sacred. "He would have liked that last shot, Tom." Tommy's face didn't move for a second. Then, finally it crumpled, in the way a face crumples only for someone who had been holding it together for a very long time and was not going to hold it together one more minute. "Yes, sir," he said. "He would have." And the two of them, an old man in a faded brown jacket and a retired gunnery sergeant in a green field coat, stood on that firing line at Pine Ridge and said nothing to each other for the better part of a minute, because there was nothing left that needed to be said out loud. It was Derek who moved first. He crossed the crowd like a man walking to a courtroom. He was 26 years old. He had wanted for about 3 years now to be exactly the kind of person who did not exist for men like Walt Hendricks to notice. He had been standing behind that counter 18 months pretending, to himself and to anyone who would listen, that this was what he had chosen. And he had just stood in the office and watched through a dirty pane of glass an old man whose name he had mocked put a 9th shot into the 9 ring at 1,000 metres and a 10th shot into the 10 ring at 1,000 metres and set a record that the world within a week was going to know about. He stopped about 6 feet from Walt. His hands were shaking worse than the old man's had been. "Sir," he said. His voice broke on the word. He swallowed. He tried again. "Sir, Colonel Hendricks, I don't know what to... I called you." Walt looked at him. Not angry, not kind, just looking. The way a man looks at a young tree that has grown crooked and is going to have to decide on its own whether to straighten out or keep going the way it's going. "Son," Walt said. "What's your name?" "To Derek, sir. Derek Callahan." "Derek? Did anybody ever tell you about the day Elias Moore died?" "No, sir. Didn't think so. I'll tell you someday if you want to know. But right now, I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything, sir?" "Go put the pot on. I'd like a cup of coffee." Derek blinked. He opened his mouth. He closed it. And then, very quietly, he nodded. And he turned around, and he walked back to the office at the same measured pace of a man who had just been given something he absolutely did not deserve, and who understood at some new level that his entire life was going to be spent trying to deserve it. Jeff met him at the office door. Jeff did not say anything. Jeff simply reached out and put one hand on Derek's shoulder and squeezed it once. Then he let him go and he went to make the coffee himself, because Derek's hands were shaking too hard to hold the pot. Outside, the crowd slowly began to move again. Somebody started clapping. Somebody else shushed them. The clap died. People looked at Tommy. Tommy shook his head, the smallest possible motion. This was not a moment for applause. This was a moment for respect, and respect is a quieter thing than applause is. And some crowds know the difference and some don't. And this crowd today did. And while the office coffee pot hissed and the flags on the 1,000-metre berm kept lifting and falling, and while an old brass casing with a folded letter inside it stood on the bench of Lane 7 catching the morning light, another car was pulling into the gravel lot of Pine Ridge. A silver Toyota, 30 years old, rust along the wheel wells. Inside it, a woman in her late 40s with her hands tight on the wheel and tears already forming at the corners of her eyes was parking next to Tommy's truck. Rebecca Hendricks had not seen her father in 8 months, but Tommy Branson had called her, on the way up, and she had driven 3.5 hours without stopping. Rebecca didn't run. Walt had never liked running unless there was a reason for it, and his daughter, at 47, had inherited his dislike. She crossed the gravel at a walk. She was wearing jeans and a plain grey sweater. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were the same pale cedar grey as her father's, and as they found him on the firing line, they filled and spilled, and she did not make any attempt to wipe them. Walt saw her. Something in his shoulders, which had been square for 40 years, finally loosened. He walked to meet her. They met halfway across the covered walkway. She did not hug him, not yet. She stopped in front of him and she looked at him and she said, "Dad, you promised you were done coming here." "I am now," he said. She looked down. She nodded. Then she did hug him, a long, slow hug, the kind a grown woman gives a father who she has spent too many years not quite understanding and has just understood a little bit more. Walt put one hand on the back of her head, and he held her. Behind them, Tommy Branson quietly turned his back, and most of the rest of the crowd did too, because there are moments that are not for public consumption, and most people, if you give them the chance, will know one when they see it. In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge did several things. They did not talk to the press, because Walt asked them not to, and Walt was the kind of man whose requests were honoured without argument. But they did, on the next Saturday, take down the brass plate that had hung on the record wall for 40 years, and they took it to a shop in Richmond, and they had the engraver add 3 lines beneath the original. Record rebroken, September 27th, 2025, by the same hand. Colonel Walter J. Hendricks, USMC. The new plate went back on the wall in the exact same spot. Lane 7, by quiet agreement that never required a meeting or a memo, became the Hendricks Lane. Pete the range officer made a small placard and mounted it on the bench. Nobody was forbidden from using the lane. Most people just didn't, out of a kind of respect that they would have found difficult to put into words. Derek Callahan kept his job. Walt had specifically asked that he keep his job. Derek spent 6 months taking a quiet shooting class from Jeff on his days off, and eventually he became a competent shooter in his own right, though never a great one. He had other gifts. He discovered, slowly, that he was good at teaching beginners, the nervous ones, the uncertain ones, the ones who came in convinced they were going to embarrass themselves. He had been one of them, underneath everything. He started every class the same way. He said, "Listen, the first thing I need you to know is that I used to be an idiot. I was lucky enough to find out. Most people aren't. Let's start." And Marcus, from Lane 9, drove home that Saturday afternoon and did not sleep that night, and the next morning he signed up for a summer precision rifle course at a school in Virginia, and 4 years later he graduated first in his class at Quantico Scout Sniper School. In his graduation speech he told a story about an old man in a faded brown jacket. The world of shooting is a small world, and word of what had happened at Pine Ridge travelled through it the way fire travels through dry grass, quietly, continuously, and impossible to put out once it had started. Letters began arriving at Walt's brick house at the edge of town. Some were from old friends he had not heard from in decades. Some were from strangers. Some were from young people who had not yet been born the last time he had squeezed a trigger in anger, and who had read his name on a record plate in a gun shop in Iowa, or in Tennessee or in Oregon, and had decided, because of that name, to try to be better at one particular small thing than they had thought they could be. Walt answered every letter. He wrote by hand on plain white paper in the same steady block letters with which he had signed the logbook that morning. He was not a sentimental man, but he believed in the discipline of answering what was put in front of you. Margaret had taught him that, and Elias Moore before her, and he was not going to stop doing it now. He did not return to Pine Ridge. There was no reason to. The thing he had come for was done. The promise was kept. The record he had told Elias Moore about in a field hospital in 1968 had been finally and properly set, and he had done it at the age the Marines would have called, with a lack of sentiment that he still appreciated, well past the window. He lived the rest of his years quietly, drinking the coffee Margaret had taught him to make, tending the pines she had planted, and sitting on the porch at 5:15 every morning watching a sun come up that, as far as he was concerned, he had no business still being around to see. But the plate was on the wall, and the plate will be on the wall long after Walt and long after anyone who was there that Saturday morning is gone. Some skills do not fade, some promises do not expire, and some men, no matter how old they get, no matter how worn their jackets or how quiet their voices or how politely they let themselves be mistaken for what they are not, some men are exactly who they have always been, and the only question is whether the rest of us have the eyes to see it while there is still time. If you believe that the measure of a man is not in his appearance but in what he has carried in silence, then do one thing for him before you go. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with a veteran you love, and in the comments below type the name we should never forget, Elias Moore, because he was there too.